Hello, I'm Daniel Hume, and today we're going to talk about AI and its impact on marketing and business. I've been involved in AI for about 25 years. My undergraduate, my PhD postdocs were all in AI from UCL here in London. I started the company about 18 years ago that's been building some of the biggest AI solutions in the world. And I sold that company to WPP, the biggest marketing company in the world, about 4 years ago, where I take on the Chief AI Officer role, so coordinating AI across about 100,000 people. And I get involved in investing in companies now and also starting companies. I've just started a company to solve machine consciousness. But today we're going to talk about AI in marketing. So this is me, it's boring. Let's talk about AI. So I guess for the past 15 years, companies have been told that they need to build data lakes, put Tableau on top, hire data scientists, machine learning experts, and by extracting insights from data and giving those insights to human beings, that'll lead to better decisions. If I'm honest with you all, giving human beings better insights doesn't typically lead to better decisions. Companies don't have insight problems, they have decision problems. And decision making is actually a completely different field in computer science. And it also turns out that humans are not very good at making decisions. I don't know if you've read the book by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. There are lots of books out there that will convince you that humans are dysfunctional at making certain types of decisions. Daniel Kahneman argues that we have a fast brain and a slow brain. And there are parallels in terms of how our brains work with how AIs work, which I'll talk about later on. So let me just give you an idea of a decision problem that humans are not particularly good at. Imagine you have a delivery van and your delivery van has to deliver packages around these 24 points. After a few minutes, we'll draw a nice path around those points. Now, how long will it take a computer to get the shortest path? The one that's going to save the most amount of time, energy, petrol? Maybe you're thinking seconds or milliseconds. It's actually somewhere between 10 seconds and 20 billion years. So if you put 24 times 23 times 22, 24 factorial in your calculator, you get this number of routes. That's how many solutions there are around 24 points. If you had a computer that can check 1 million routes a second, it would take 20 billion years to go through all of them and say, this one that I looked at 10 billion years ago, this one's the shortest one, you should do that. If I had another point in the map, it becomes 25 times 20 billion years, so 5,000 billion years. Another point, it becomes 26 times 5,000 billion years. These are exponential problems. They get ugly very quickly. You have lots of these problems in your organizations, and they're either being solved by human beings badly or by algorithms, probably badly. The point here is if you choose the wrong algorithm, it will literally take longer than the age of the universe to solve this problem. If you choose the right algorithm, it will take milliseconds. That's the opportunity cost in choosing the wrong algorithms. So if I build a system that I give data to and it makes a decision, and tomorrow I give you the same data, it makes the same decision, what I have is automation. And automation is amazing because we can get computers to do things better than human beings. But does anybody know the definition of stupidity? Doing the same thing over again and expect a different answer. I would controversially argue that by definition, automation is stupid. It's not AI. I know that everybody that currently touches these words calls themselves an AI company. We get more clients, we get more funding. The reality is that there are many definitions of AI. The most popular definition, I think, is the weakest definition, which is getting computers to do things that humans can do. ChatGPT was launched 3 years ago. We now have computers that can correspond in natural language, recognize objects and images. When we get machines to behave like humans, and because humans are the most intelligent thing we know in the universe, we assume that that's intelligence. And again, there are plenty of books out there that will convince you that humans are not that intelligent. That's a different conversation. There's a much better definition of AI that comes from definition of intelligence. Instead of using human beings as the pinnacle of intelligence, it's this definition from the 80s, which is goal-directed adaptive behavior. What you want to do is build systems and make decisions, learn about whether those decisions are good or bad, adapt themselves so next time they make better decisions. And if I'm being totally honest with you all, if I held what we do in industry to this definition, one might controversially argue that nobody's doing AI, which is of course ridiculous because we're all doing AI, but building safe adaptive systems in production is extremely hard. Most systems at the moment are automation. The true paradigm of AI are systems that can safely adapt themselves in production. I'm going to give you a different way of thinking about it, and I'm going to apply it to our industry, the marketing industry. Before I do, a little bit of a history lesson. So this is AI in the 60s and 70s. It's Socrates. Socrates is famous for inspiring the Socratic method. If I say to you that Socrates is a man and that all men are mortal, I can infer that Socrates is mortal. I can create new knowledge. AI in the 60s and 70s was writing down lots of things that we know about the world to try to infer new knowledge. It didn't really work. It didn't really scale. In the 80s and 90s, a new type of AI came along that's modeling how our brains work. This is the brain of Bumblebee. My PhD 20 years ago was trying to model the brain of a bumblebee machine. Bumblebees can do amazing things. They can navigate 3D worlds, they recognize objects, they talk to each other, they solve problems. They don't handle windows very well, but ultimately they're very smart creatures. And the question was, can you model 1 million neurons in a machine? 20 years ago we couldn't, but we can now model billions of neurons, and we currently call these large language models. Now, large language models are crude representations of our brain. They require lots and lots of energy to train, lots of data. They learn very slowly. Our brains operate on the power of a light bulb. We'll talk about this later on. There are many innovations that are coming to allow us to build much more smarter brains. Large language models are getting smarter, and 8 years ago they were like toddlers. They regurgitated some words, most of it didn't make sense. ChatGPT was launched 3 years ago, and arguably that was like an intoxicated graduate. 50% of what ChatGPT comes out with is confidently incorrect. We are seeing it now graduate to like a master's level where it can do rudimentary reasoning. I think in the next year or so we'll have a PhD level, so something that can take complex problems and solve them. I think in the next few years we'll have a postdoc, so something that can actually apply the complex scientific method to solving and pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. And by the end of this decade, I think we'll all have a professor in our pocket, something that can not only answer complex questions, but can ask questions that humanity has never asked. I would argue that even a professor in your pocket still can't solve that delivery problem. It can use algorithms to solve that problem, or it can build algorithms, but in its head, it doesn't have the capability of solving that delivery problem, which is why it's important to understand this is not a panacea that's going to solve all of our problems, and there are other algorithms out there we need to utilize. So the framework that I use to think about this is through applications, and not through technology, and not through definitions. And I believe there are 6 categories of applications of AI that can be applied to any friction across any supply chain in any industry, and I'll try to apply it to marketing. The first one actually is task automation. We all have repetitive, mundane, structured tests that we can tasks that we can use AI to replace. You can use very, very simple algorithms, if then else statements, macros, robotic process or automation to replace mundane tasks that we're doing to free up ourselves to do more interesting, impactful things. You don't need to gravitate towards complex technologies. The second category is probably close to all of our hearts, is generative AI. Now, large language models give everybody the ability to create any generic content, imagery, text, now sound, now video. Whilst this is cute, I would argue that this is not going to differentiate your business. The problem is, how do you create brand-specific, production-grade, differentiated content? That last mile is extremely hard. And I want to geek out a second. There are broadly 4 ways of making a brain smart. The first way is asking it better questions. We can all prompt better, and by prompting better, we get better results, but it's only going to be bounded by the knowledge of that brain. The second way of making a brain smart is giving that intoxicated graduate your brand guidelines, your written copy, your tone of voice, your imagery, and just like an intoxicated graduate with access to those materials, it will give you an ad that's 50% good. That's how most systems are currently being built. The third way of making a brain smart is taking that graduate and turning it into an expert. In the AI world, there are only some models that you can actually tune and train, and it currently takes months to train these models. You know how long it takes to become an expert. It takes human beings years of blood, sweat, tears, trial and error, mentorship, iteration. And so building AI brains or experts is extremely hard. In WPP, when we build what we call brand brains, a brand brain is tasked with creating production grade brand specific content. We use an agentic approach. You have an AI that's an expert at your written copy, your tone of voice, your imagery, your brand guidelines, your company values. And just like in the real world, you get these different experts collaborating and communicating to get to an answer greater than the sum of the parts. The power of agents isn't agency. The power of agents are having them collaborate and create solutions greater than the sum of the parts. Once you can create content very quickly, now the question is, how do people perceive content? For the first time ever, we can build brains that recreate how people think and feel about things. In WPP, we call these brand brains. Historically, if I show you an ad or a policy or some promotion material, I didn't know what goes in your mind and body. For the first time ever, we can now recreate how people think and feel about things, and we can use those signals to create better content and also more accurately predict activation. And unlike brand brains, where the complexity is how you tune and pipeline these technologies, the differentiator for audience brains is really just data. Now, in marketing, there's been a history of collecting names, addresses, dates of birth, gender. Where you live and how old you are is a crude proxy for how you perceive things. How you perceive an ad will depend on the time of the day, the weather, whether you've just fallen in love, how much money you have in your account, how well your football team played at the weekend. Understanding the data sources that you need to build representative brains is a differentiator. And AI is getting really good at understanding what is it that human beings value. There's this paper from Harvard Business Review back in 2016 where somebody mapped 30 things that human beings value to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. AI is getting really good at understanding what people value and how to then reinforce those associations. If I say to you, what brand or product do you think about? If I say safe cars, lots of people will say Volvo. What about extreme sports? Maybe you've said Red Bull. What about, this is a tricky one, Christmas? And maybe people will say Coca-Cola. And the reason why they say Coca-Cola is because I've warmed up your drinks brain. But what I'm doing is I'm activating some neurons in your brain. I'm asking you to report on what product neurons they're associated with. The goal of marketing is to reinforce brands and products with these values. And it's a really interesting, hard problem to solve. Machine learning is what people called AI 4 years ago. We already know my opinion, giving human beings better insights doesn't lead to better decisions. In our world, we call this our performance brain. And the power of machine learning is not making predictions. The power of machine learning is explaining those predictions. So if I show you an ad with a black cat, I can predict the clicks and the likes and the sales. But what machine learning can do, if you implement it correctly, it can say, Daniel, if you change that from a black cat to a ginger cat, you're going to get more clicks, likes, and sales because that person likes Garfield. Is a terrible example. I need a better example. But the point is that machine learning can surface insights from data in ways that human beings can't, in the ways that generative AI can't. And we can use those insights to ultimately make better decisions. Complex decision. Oh no, actually, before we get to complex decision, we're going to talk about creativity. So we can use machine learning actually to solve to help us solve two very important problems in creativity. I call it the Monet problem. So the first Monet problem is, how do I create a rendition of Monet of Tony the Tiger holding a can of Coke, wearing some Nikes? Now there are an infinite number of renditions of that image. One of them is going to activate your neurons the most. Now the question is, in that infinite landscape, how do we find the right one? And that's a machine learning problem. The second is not how do we create a Monet, but how do we create Monet? How do we come up with impressionism or cubism? How do we come up with a new genre that's going to capture the mind's, heart's imagination of this current generation? These are machine learning problems. Complex decision making, we've already talked about. Now, again, if I've got 5 pieces of content to allocate to 5 channels, or 5 people to allocate to 5 jobs, let's say, there are 5 factorial, so 120 possible solutions. If I make the problem a little bit more complicated, and I've got 15 pieces of content to allocate to 15 channels, there are over 1 trillion possible solutions. So one rule to take away today: anything more than 7, don't use a human for. An industry have problems of this size, so here are 500 channels. There are lots of possible solutions. And just to put this number into context, this is how many atoms there are in the universe. So once you reach about 60 things, you have to consider there are more solutions than there are atoms in the universe. WPP have to push thousands of pieces of content across thousands of channels every second of every day. Doing that well is extremely hard. It requires deep expertise in optimization. The final category is human augmentation, and this is really exciting because a few years ago I'd be talking about how we can use exoskeletons and cybernetics to make ourselves faster, better, stronger. Well, one of the things that's actually happening now is that people are using their AIs as therapists. They're telling them their hopes, their dreams, their desires. At some point, you'll give those AIs agency. You'll give them the ability to purchase things. And we as a marketing community need to figure out not only how do we market to human beings, we now need to figure out how do we market to the billions of AIs that are going to be making purchasing decisions or recommendations. And by the way, those AIs are going to be much more rational in terms of how they approach purchasing. They're going to be trying to align your values with the values of the companies that you buy from much more effectively than human beings. So I love these categories because they allow you to navigate this complex world of AI safety, security, ethics, and governance. There's a huge amount of misunderstanding associated with these words. When I implement AI in production, there are really 3 questions I ask myself. The first one is the intent appropriate? Really, the only difference between human beings and AIs right now is that humans have intent. AIs don't have intent, and it's the intent that needs to get scrutinized from an ethics perspective. You don't need AI ethicists. The second question you need to ask yourself is, are my algorithms explainable? The difference between software and AI is that AI tends to be opaque in terms of how it makes its decisions. If you make them transparent or explainable, then most of these words go away. You can govern them, you can audit them much more effectively. And the final question you need to ask yourself is a strange one. It's not what happens if my AI goes wrong. It's because as engineers, when we build systems, we think about where they fail and mitigating those failure points. You now need to ask yourself, what happens if my AI goes very right? For the first time ever, we can massively overachieve the goal, and it can actually then cause harm elsewhere in the supply chain. There's a human unconscious bias called homophily, which is that we tend to like and trust people that look and sound like us. Now, if we let AI loose to optimize ads, you might end up with a world of you selling to you, which might be very good for business, but it might be enforcing bias and bigotry and social bubbles. We need to think about the consequences of AI massively overachieving its goal. So there are broadly 7 core frictions across the marketing supply chain I'm interested in solving for. And again, there's only a few of these frictions that lend themselves to generative AI. I won't go into these into details here, but dynamic segmentation, for example, is an insight problem. Creativity is actually a generative AI problem. So here are the things that I'm currently working on to make sure that our platform, WPP Open, is differentiated from our competitors. So I would argue that companies need to build these 3 digital twins of their supply chain. One is the flow of goods across your supply chain, which is WPP Open. The second is your back office processes. We all have them: hiring, firing, onboarding, offboarding. We know that most of those back office processes are bureaucratic. They slow down innovation. AI is not only making them more efficient, they're changing the way that we do back office processes to make them much more effective. So one of the things that Gore-Tex do, the clothing company, for their expenses, is they let people expense whatever they want. All of their expenses are publicly available, and then people self-police each other, which is a much more effective way of doing expenses. And finally, the final digital twin is you. It's the workforce. It's understanding your hopes, your dreams, your desires, making sure that you're being allocated to work that aligns with your values and the values of the company. And I think those companies that are going to survive and thrive are the ones that create these 3 digital twins. And I've talked a little bit about this. We're moving now from AIs to agents, and those agents at some point will have agency in the physical world that will spawn the robotic revolution. And as I mentioned, there are new innovations that are coming out of academia that are allowing us to be inspired about how biological brains work, and then use them to build AIs that are much more energy efficient, much more effective at being intelligent. And what I think will happen over the coming years is that neuroscience and neuromarketing will become a superpower. We're going to have to figure out how to look inside the brains of AIs and human beings to figure out how they perceive things and how to influence them in a safe and responsible way. I've talked a little bit about innovation. Ultimately, the more innovative you are, the more adaptive you are, the more intelligent you are. And I think there are 3 things that you need to survive and thrive in the world of AI. I love Steve Jobs' definition, by the way, of innovation. He said, innovation is creativity that ships. And for me, the most important word in that definition is the word that. That's my job, which is taking ideas and getting to the point where they're driving value. That process is full of frictions and it's challenging. The goal is, how do we use AI and technology to reduce that friction, to be able to adapt more quickly to a changing world? I think there are 3 things that you need. The first is data. If you have data that contains insights that's more useful than your competitors, then you have an advantage. It's data that makes the AI smart. If you don't, then you need to grab market share very, very quickly. The second is AI talent. Now, there's lots of people that have rebranded themselves as AI experts over the past 3 years. If you genuinely want to build differentiated AI solutions, you need to have differentiated talent. And there's only a handful of deep mind companies out there. I'd like to think that Satalia inside WPP is one of them. But you need to be honest with yourself about your ability to attract, retain, and motivate talent. And finally, again, it's you. If you don't understand about the transformational power of these technologies, if you place the wrong bets, then we're going to fail. Fortunately, WPP CEO Cindy Rose is all in on AI. She deeply understands the transformational power of these technologies, and I think we're placing the right bets. I'm going to close by saying it's not good enough for an organization just to have a strong, profitable business. You need to have a purpose. If you don't have a purpose, you're not going to attract AI talent, and you're probably not going to attract AI agents that are going to be buying from you. I joined WPP despite actually knowing nothing about marketing, because I believe in that purpose. Their purpose is to use the power of creativity to make a better future. And I think a better future is a world where we're using these technologies to bring the cost of goods down, to make them more abundant, and to create actually a world where all of the things that we need to survive and thrive as a human is economically free. And I think that enterprise and marketing is the engine to help us create that world. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you at some point.
Thank you, Dr. Daniel Hum, for the impactful video presentation.